very pleased to introduce our speaker for today. Dr. Caroline Black is an assistant professor of early childhood education at Northern Arizona University. We're really excited to have a speaker from NAU here to join us. Prior to obtaining her doctorate, Dr. Black worked as a preschool teacher and early childhood administrator in New York City. She has three primary strands of research. A, understanding linkages among family relationships, parenting, and children's psychosocial development. B, identifying implementation and evaluation processes required of effective early childhood and family support programs. And C, engaging in community-based participatory research to address social inequities of young mothers in Northern Arizona. So honestly, it's hard to think of a better representative to, given her research interest, such a perfect match with FMI to kick off our speaker series this fall. I will say, so we'll let Dr. Black give her presentation. We'll reserve time at the end for questions. If you do have questions, you can share them in the Q&A. If you feel comfortable doing so, we will allow you to unmute and turn on your video if you'd like to ask the question yourself. It'll be nice to be able to build a sort of a conversation in a community, even though we are doing this all virtually. So with that, I will go ahead and turn it over to Dr. Black. Thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you so much, Melissa, for the warm welcome. And I'm so enthusiastic to be here with everyone today. So first, before I get started, I want to just notify everyone I'm struggling with a little bit of delay in my internet. I do live in rural Arizona. So as many of us know, internet is not an equitable service. So I just like to provide that information with everyone. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen as well. So again, thank you so much. I'm really excited to be here, and I'm looking forward to sharing with you today some research on supportive co-parenting relationships for adult and adolescent mothers, exploring linkages with maternal cognitive stimulation and child behavior. So the first piece of background I'd like to explore with you is just having everyone share a common set of knowledge about what we're exploring today. So supportive co-parenting is the extent to which one partner values, appreciates, and supports another's contribution as a parent. And extensive research suggests that there are direct associations between supportive co-parenting and children's development. Research suggests that supportive co-parenting associates with lower levels of problem behaviors, including externalizing and internalizing problem behaviors in early childhood, and promotes prosocial behaviors. We also know that responsive co-parenting indirectly affects child school readiness, inclusive of literacy, math, and reading through parenting behaviors, particularly responsive and sensitive parenting. And we also know that responsive co-parenting relates in part to cognitive stimulation. And this research I know is done by some folks on the call, and in their work, they broadly conceptualized responsive parenting, one component being that stimulation piece. So it is an underexplored area and one that I wanted to explore more deeply in this study. As I mentioned, we know that parenting supportive co-parenting has direct and indirect effects on child behavior, directly through emotional spillover or potentially social modeling, and indirectly through theory outlined through the parenting process model. So one important thing I've picked up on as I've coursed through literature on supportive co-parenting and co-parenting in general is that there is burgeoning research on understanding co-parenting in families that are diverse. So unmarried families, never married parents, visiting fathers, low-income families. So there's this movement in our field, a mushrooming, pretty pronounced, that explores what co-parenting looks like in families who may have more adversities or may experience more vulnerabilities than other families. However, from my vantage point, I've noticed that a lot of research has actually failed to explore this very you know, resilient aspect of many young parents' relationships. So I like to conceptualize supportive co-parenting as a common yet overlooked asset for children in young families. And we know through research that young mothers, so mothers between the ages of 15 and 19, have multiple developmental responsibilities. They have co-occurring responsibilities of parenthood and adolescence or young adulthood, which creates additional stress and strain on themselves and potentially those around them. So they're dealing themselves with some extra stress and vulnerabilities. We also know that young mothers and their children are at greater risk for poor developmental outcomes than adult mothers and their children. Outcomes for their children, like higher risk for problem behaviors. For mothers, they're at greater risk for having lower incomes, having a longer period of time required to complete schooling, and as well harsh parenting. So there are a number of risk factors. However, in alignment with the FMI, speaker series and institute in general, my focus is really on resilience, is understanding these common yet overlooked assets for young families. And part of this is understanding potentially why co-parenting and a supportive co-parent could be so critical for a young family. And we do know that beyond social inequities and health disparities that largely cause an extent of these inequitable outcomes, that there are social and emotional strains that young mothers experience as well. So relationships with social networks are often strained due to early pregnancy. So families may not accept the young mother's choice to have a child. Peers may reject a young mother's given non-traditional developmental life course trajectories. And often we've read that young mothers often experience stereotypes and stigmatization through some of the care providers, through educators, through healthcare providers. So they're dealing with a social network that isn't readily supportive of their decision. And so what I find so beautiful and inspiring, and really an aspect of overlooked resilience, is that many young parents, especially around the time surrounding pregnancy or surrounding childbirth, right before and right after, a few years after childbirth, have a very strong desire to co-raise a child and build a family together. And research strongly suggests that this is an asset. This is something that can help promote positive behavioral and developmental outcomes, and then as well prevent some challenging behaviors and developmental outcomes that are common to young families. So because there's such limited research on young parents' supportive co-parenting relationships, we don't understand them very well. There's a lot of mixed findings. And again, as a researcher, I've looked across decades of work that has just overemphasized deficits. And part of my line of research is really aiming just to clearly focus on strengths. So what do we know about young parents? Recent research that colleagues and I completed suggests that using growth mixture modeling, looking across 8 years, the first 8 years of parenthood, that 52% of young parents maintain supportive co-parenting relationships across children's early development. So that's from birth through child age 9. So this is a majority and is in opposition to much of the deficit-based research that underscores uninvolved fathers and couples who are not invested in supporting their children's positive development. Research that colleagues and I also completed, which is under review, suggests that higher levels of supportive co-parenting in teenage-headed families links to lower levels and slower declines in children's internalizing and externalizing problem behaviors. So this suggests that parents who do have more supportive relationships have children whose emotional behavioral trajectories are reduced in terms of the severity of problem behaviors. So again, we could really conceptualize this as a factor that helps to mitigate common developmental challenges for young families. We also know, on the other hand, that young mothers and their partners are more likely to end romantic relationships than adult parents. And this typically happens within the first 5 years of parenthood. And again, is commonly overemphasized and overlooked instead of focusing on that co parenting relationship, which is often maintained. Again, we know because of the extensive amount of deficit-based research that young families, young parents are more likely to have relationships characterized by ineffective communication and unresolved conflict compared to adult parents. So again, a lot of mixed findings, and really a rationale for me to think about more deeply and intently what supportive co-parenting, what type of contributions that this responsive relationship could have for young families. So, as I've mentioned, limitations of past research, well, this wouldn't be a limitation, but given the mixed findings, what I found so compelling recently is that for young fathers, so this is obviously not young moms, but their partners, demonstrate a stronger supportive co-parenting relationships demonstrate a stronger association with father engagement for adolescent fathers and adult fathers. So this work suggests that there are going to be differences by group, right? That the paternal age is going to moderate the association between supportive co-parenting and critical family processes like father engagement. So this was a key motivation for the current study. As I've mentioned a lot, there's very little work that has explored supportive co-parenting as an asset that actually may be more beneficial to children of young mothers than adult mothers. And again, the rationale behind that is understanding that, people in young parents' lives may not be supportive, and that co-parent may be a critical relationship for them to manage parenting responsibilities, be a responsive and stimulating parent. So a very overlooked family process. And a need, right? There's always a need. So many programs that actually aim to serve young families fail to meet their needs because, again, there's extensive stigmatization and stereotyping about risks, the overemphasis of risks, and a poor understanding of family strengths. And because of this mismatch, we often see that young families, who may have opportunities to join home visiting programs or early childhood programs are very hesitant. They may drop out early, and there's often tension between providers and families. So again, this is, in a nutshell, the rationale for the work. So the research questions this study aimed to ask is to what extent does maternal age at childbirth explain group differences and direct effects of supportive co-parenting on child behavior and indirect effects via maternal cognitive stimulation? So our hypothesis is that we expect children of young mothers will benefit more from supportive co-parenting than adult mothers, and that maternal cognitive stimulation will explain these associations. So my methods here, I and my team use the Fragile Families and Child Wellbeing Study database, which oversampled unmarried parents in urban areas in the United States, and for that reason has generated a large sample of young mothers. As well, the study made an unprecedented investment in gathering data on a variety of family processes, including co-parenting, parenting, and child developmental outcomes. So the data set is a strong fit for the research. So for this study, I extracted data from wave 3, which is when children were 3 years old, so 3 years after baseline data collection. Sample inclusion criteria required parents had a functional, adult relationship. So this included parents who were married, parents who were cohabitating or visiting, parents who ended romantic relationships and maintained a friendship, and as well those who divorced but were still in contact. As well, I only selected cases for which the child lives a majority of the time with the mother. And this left out of an initial sample of nearly 5,000 observations, a study sample of 3,420. So my measures, my primary IV of interest, my independent variable is maternal perceived supportive co-parenting. This is measured by 6 items on a 1 to 4 scale, and Cronbach's alpha for that is zero 0.9, so very high internal consistency reliability, and aims to measure the extent to which mothers perceive their partners to provide that supportive, you know, the support in their co-parenting relationship, the affirmation that they're, doing a good job as a parent, respect and, value for the mother's role as a parent. My mediator, as I've mentioned, is maternal stimulating parenting or maternal cognitive stimulation. And again, this is a very understudied aspect of a mechanism that could explain the association between supportive co-parenting and child developmental outcomes. So I was very curious to see the extent to which this mediator explained those relationships. This measure was included 5 items and included activities that are considered cognitively stimulating for a young child. So things like singing songs, reading books, playing games, things like that. And mothers responded to categorical responses that identified how many times a week they engaged in those activities. So Cronbach's alpha was adequate at 0.73. And for 2 of my dependent variables, I selected child externalizing and internalizing problem behaviors measured by the child behavior checklist, which is a norm referenced and standardized checklist, very common, and uses a 0 to 2 scale, 0, 1, 2, and again is a maternal report. So internalizing items examined things like mother perceives child has feelings that are easily hurt, is excessively shy, and as well externalizing problem behaviors like easily frustrated or non-compliant. So for this measure, we took the average items for the full set, or the item average, excuse me, to create 2 separate variables. So there are approximately 20 to 25 items given the scale for each of those subscales, and we just took the average item for those outcomes. My third dependent variable was child prosocial behaviors, and this was measured with 9 items on a 0 to 2 scale, again, which was a maternal report, and Cronbach's alpha was adequate at 0.73, and this measured child's prosocial behaviors like child understands others' feelings. So finally, my moderator, and in alignment with our hypothesis that young children of young mothers may benefit more from supportive co-parenting relationships, we created a binary moderator that demarcated any mother who was 20 years old or younger, and then anyone older than that. So fairly simple and straightforward coding scheme there. We also included a set of covariates, some of which are included here: maternal and paternal poverty status, age, relationship status, and depression, child temperament, and sex. So our analytic approach is structural equation modeling. We examine direct and indirect effects models to test for mediation. We also examined direct effects or the extent to which direct effects are moderated by maternal age. And then as well, we examined the extent to which maternal age moderated indirect effects. So that is considered moderated mediation. That was very fun to figure out with syntax. So, and finally, we used full information maximum likelihood for missing data in M+. Okay, so real quick, I'm a visual person, and this model really, I think, conceptualizes what the study is all about. The magenta square on the left-handmost side is the maternal supportive co-parenting. It has direct associations with all of our child outcomes, which are in the slate blue and gray boxes all the way on the right-hand side. Those direct effects were tested first. We positioned then maternal cognitive stimulation as a mediator. Next, we tested for moderation of direct effects, and then we tested for moderation of the mediation with those variables. So let's see what some of the results look like. In terms of demographics, we have, just to highlight some of the baseline information, as is very consistent with urban young families. A majority of this sample were African American or Black, depending on cultural preferences for that racial group. As well, a large proportion were Latina, and just to call it out, these are not exclusive categories. So you will find that the totals exceed 100%, but again, are very consistent with prior research. I would like to underscore, as a community of scholars who live in Arizona, and understanding that early pregnancy falls along the lines of social and health inequities. We know that here there is probably a larger population of Indigenous and Native American young families, given the historical the history of the region, and then as well, given that Arizona has a much more rural landscape and than many other areas, and as well, this study did not examine or sample from rural areas. So unsurprisingly, we know that many young families are less likely to be married than adult families, so that's effectively represented in our sample demographics. Interestingly, I thought it was quite notable that the young mothers had noticeably higher percentage of parents who maintained a friendship, and who were no longer romantically involved. So again, as someone who's looking for strengths of young families, I see this as a clear strength, and one that probably contributes to their ability to effectively co-parent. So other demographic statistics here, we see that in terms of income and poverty, that young mothers have higher rates of being in the lowest, or having highest levels of poverty, and having lower percentage in higher income brackets. And again, research suggests that due to alternative life trajectories that do not align with the way our school systems are set up, or the way our culture sequences education and learning, that there are some disruptions to learning and education. However, research does suggest that by late 20s and 30s, young mothers have obtained high school degrees and enrolled in many secondary education programs, and those rates are comparable to peers with similar backgrounds. So some final descriptive statistics. I'm just going to call out a couple things here. I did means and standard deviation, and then ran some independent t-tests just to see what the differences were. And I also want to call out something I'd love to chat about when we have a conversation after I'm done presenting, is the problematic nature of comparing young mothers to adult mothers. I really hesitated at a certain point in finalizing these analyses, because I realized so much deficit-based discourse is generated when we compare, instead of focusing on the unique experiences that young families have. So with that being said, I did highlight maternal cognitive stimulation and child prosocial behavior as two one maternal outcome and a child outcome that is essentially equal between both adult and young parents. So again, prior research has suggested that young mothers are less likely to engage in cognitively stimulating activities with their children. So this is quite counter to that. As well, I think it's notable that children of young families have, very similar levels of prosocial behavior. And again, as someone looking for strengths, I think these are all very encouraging pieces of information. As well, I cannot not address, there are significant differences in child problem behaviors and supportive co-parenting, which is consistent with the literature. So again, a lot of mixed findings, which I think for a researcher is really enticing, right? It encourages us to do more research. So here are results of the direct effects model. Actually, so this should just say direct effects models. So just to clarify that. So I'm going to sequentially walk through kind of the steps of the mediation and then go into the moderation. The first set of analyses are again, this just direct effects of supportive co-parenting, predicting child outcomes. So in the green box, you'll see on the left-hand side the full sample, next the young adult and teenage sample, and then the adult mother. And in this set of results and the remaining, I do characterize the mothers as teenage and young adult because it is 3 years after childbirth. And some mothers are now going to be in their early to mid 20s. So let's look at some findings here. We see that the linkages between supportive co-parenting and prosocial behaviors are both not significant. At first, somewhat surprising, but I think the findings will make sense in a moment. One thing I noticed is just that it looks like the standardized beta coefficient is a little bit larger for young mothers. So that was noteworthy and kind of got my hopes up for a moderation effect, but we will find out a little bit later. The magnitude of the effect is exactly the same, using 2 decimal places for the effects of supportive co-parenting on child externalizing. The only difference is really the p-value. We see that for actually, I'm noticing my p-value should be switched. So the trend is supposed to be for young mothers, and the p less than 0.001 should be for adult mothers. So my apologies for that confusion. And then we see some very different results for linkages between supportive co-parenting and child internalizing. We see a non-significant effect and a much smaller effect for young families, children in young families, and a significant and much larger effect for children in adult families. Next, we took a peek at the associations between stimulating parenting and children's outcomes, just to kind of get a peek at those potential mediational pathways. Again, from a force level perspective, the magnitude of the effect is quite similar, both for young and adult mothers, and both significant, although the strength of that relationship varies slightly. Here we see some differences in terms of the association of stimulating parenting, helping to prevent in part externalizing problem behaviors. Here we have non-significant or no findings for young families, and a highly significant finding for adult. And very similar again for the association between stimulating parenting and child internalizing. So it is suggesting here that for adult families, the maternal stimulating parenting or maternal cognitive stimulation contributes in part to lower levels of child problem behaviors, unlike that for young families. We also had to look at the linkages between supportive co-parenting and stimulating parenting, and we see the results are significant again, comparable in both and significant in both. So again, I was thinking that there could be a moderation effect here and was very excited to test for that. My confidence intervals do not suggest there was any moderation. So any small differences in the magnitude of the effect or even significance was not enough to suggest moderation. Okay, so next we go to moderated mediation, which is always a mouthful. I'll first draw your attention to moderated mediation for children of young families. And again, this is looking at the extent to which maternal age differentiates those indirect effects, right? So is that indirect pathway, is it going to be stronger for young families, or is it going to be stronger for adult families, or are there going to be no differences? So we saw the most promising results for linkages among supportive co-parenting, stimulating parenting, and prosocial behavior in young families. At the trend level, at a confidence interval of actually 80%, there was mediation, and we'll get to the moderated mediation in a moment. I got a little ahead of myself. So a trend level there, but not at that 95% confidence interval. For adult mothers, we see full mediation, actually, remembering that the initial relationship between supportive co-parenting or between let's see, was it supportive co-parenting and prosocial behavior was it was null, and that again is demonstrating that full mediation for adult families. So in the right-hand box, we have the moderated mediation. And again, as with the direct effects, there is no moderation, even though there are, some findings which are significant and others which are not. And I'm just checking time. It's about 1:48. Am I supposed to wrap up at 2? Is that correct?
Or around between 2 and 2:15, by 2:15 for sure.
Oh, okay, great, lovely. Okay, so conclusions of the study. I feel like there's a lot of information, and so I'm hoping to make sense of this with you and stimulate some thoughtful discussions. So the big takeaways for children's prosocial behaviors, as the descriptive statistics underscored to us, there is no difference between young mothers and adult mothers' levels of stimulation or differences in their children's prosocial behaviors. So again, as I've mentioned, always looking for strengths, and I think this is something noteworthy, and I'll discuss implications for programs and practice a little bit later on. For, again, child prosocial behaviors, we see that for young mothers, there was partial mediation. So there were direct and indirect effects, supportive co-parenting directly associated with higher levels of child prosocial behaviors, and then as well associated with lower, getting ahead of myself, and as well had indirect effects through the maternal cognitive stimulation. So multiple pathways of influence there. For adult mothers, we see something very different. We see that there was full mediation, meaning that net all of the effects of support, net all of other effects that supportive co-parenting was channeled completely through that maternal cognitive stimulation behavior and contributed to higher levels of child prosocial behaviors. So I would love to unpack with you at the end of our session some ideas around why we would think, that full mediation would be present for adult mothers, yet for young mothers is not there. As well, there was no moderation, so it was in contrast to my hypotheses. However, for this set of analyses, young mother, there was a larger, the magnitude of the effect was larger, although it was not significant. And again, that was that 0.05 beta coefficient compared to the 0.01. So taken together, supportive co-parent relationships are equally beneficial to children's prosocial behaviors, although pathways of influence differ by maternal age. So findings align with research suggesting that cognitive stimulation fully mediates links between SES and child cognitive development. And here I'm thinking and drawing lines between this work, which really looks at a particular set of families, right? Young mothers, their partners, and their children who are experiencing a much higher level of socio-ecological adversity, cumulative stress, social inequities. And in my mind, this essentially complements work suggesting that, the cognitive stimulation fully mediates links between SES and child cognitive development. So for child externalizing behaviors, we see that there was a difference between young mothers and adult mothers in terms of child externalizing behaviors, with children of young mothers having higher levels at year 3. For young mothers, there were direct effects trending towards significance, suggesting that higher levels of supportive co-parenting or predicted lower levels of child problem behaviors, specifically externalizing. For adult mothers, there was partial mediation, meaning direct and indirect effects. So some of those going through maternal cognitive stimulation. And again, there was no moderation. And generally, the magnitude of the effect of these associations for direct and indirect effects are fairly consistent across the full sample, young mothers and adult mothers. So I found that noteworthy. Again, as with supportive co-parenting and prosocial behaviors, we find that supportive co-parenting is equally beneficial to children, to children's externalizing behaviors in adult families as is in young families, although pathways of influence differ. And again, there were no indirect effects. So findings from this set of results build on research suggesting that there's parenting behaviors, including harsh parenting, responsive parenting, and sensitive parenting are mechanisms linking co-parenting and child problem behaviors. And I should underscore that across this study and then other studies in the field, that the magnitude is quite small. It's usually a standardized beta coefficient of point, 0.05 to 0.02 to 0.05, so quite small in magnitude. So for internalizing behaviors, very similar. There were significant differences between children of young mothers and children of adult mothers, with children of young mothers having higher levels of internalizing problem behaviors. Generally, there was a lot of inconsistency among the findings here, among the different groups. The magnitude of the effects varied, as well as the significance. So trying to understand what's driving the lack of association between supportive co-parenting and child internalizing is something I'm very interested in exploring. For adult mothers, there was partial mediation, which is consistent with child externalizing behaviors. So from this set of findings, because there were null associations for direct and indirect effects, findings may suggest that supportive co-parenting may be more beneficial to children of adult mothers, although we do know that moderation was not significant. So more to explore there. It does, again, add to mixed findings on co-parenting child internalizing behaviors in young families, as evidenced by a manuscript that I have under review right now, demonstrating actually the opposite, that in higher levels of supportive co-parenting linked with lower levels and slower declines in children's internalizing behaviors. So practice and policy implications. So we often notice that social and educational systems tend to overlook that mothers do rely on their child's father to help support them with caregiving responsibilities. And the big takeaway from this research is that there are intergenerational effects, right? We've seen that supportive co-parenting relationship associating with higher levels of child prosocial behaviors and lower levels of child externalizing behaviors, that these relationships do matter, and it is critical that we start paying attention to them as practitioners and researchers. In that line of thinking, by failing to include co-parenting fathers and father figures into programs, we do risk marginalizing young families and driving couples apart. And there was a seminal piece of research completed in 2015 by Stephanie Mulburn and a colleague, qualitative research, and it was clear that young families feel that their social networks, are a cause of their relationship deteriorating, and then as well co-parenting relationships dissolving. So understanding that our implicit bias or our initial ways of thinking about young families really needs to be we really need to take a new perspective. And as I've mentioned throughout this presentation, parents often do feel judged by providers in educational programs, by nurses, and this does relate to decreases in service utilization and essentially further entrenchment of health disparities and social inequities. So the good news is, though, that programs and practitioners, we all have an opportunity to pivot towards strengths and use strengths, family identified strengths, to help address family identified needs. And supportive co-parenting, as is my work is starting to demonstrate, can be seen as a strength of young families. It's demonstrated through both quantitative and qualitative research, with many fathers emphasizing the importance of being there for their families, and the unfortunate nature that they're often excluded from programs that aim to enhance co-parenting or even couple relationships, because often they assume fathers aren't interested in joining, or that they are excluded based on their relationship status. So the big takeaway from this work in terms of how programs and policies could use findings is thinking of supportive co-parenting as a programmatic target that really has a two-pronged, that multi-generational effect. It has a potential to contribute maternal cognitive stimulation, which we know is critical for children's school readiness, promotes, executive functioning, and is a real key driver of success in education. And then we also know, right, that a child who experiences that cognitive stimulation is going to be much better prepared for future educational experiences. So again, the two-pronged effect, it's going to promote maternal cognitive stimulation, and then in turn and directly children's prosocial behaviors, and as well some reductions potentially in externalizing problem behaviors. So another suggestion, as mentioned before, is having early childhood and family support programs, thinking of having co-parenting enhancements. So thinking about timing as a key component here. Many young families, young couples, young parents are together prior to and a few years after the child is born, and so really targeting that timing piece, building capacity in the co-parenting dyad, so they have the skills they need to maintain that supportive relationship for their children. And with that, I will close and say thank you so much for joining me, and I would just love to hear some of your thoughts about the points I brought up. And yeah, I look forward to hearing from you.
Thank you so much for that presentation, Caroline. That was terrific. If anyone has questions, you can go ahead and raise your hand, and we can allow you to unmute you and put on your video if you'd like, or you can put a question in the Q&A function. Either way, you didn't take questions. I have lots of questions that I could ask. This is relevant to my own work, but I would love to give other people an opportunity.
Thanks, Melissa.
I'll let you all think. So Caroline, I can't help thinking about the main effects between supportive co-parenting and cognitive stimulation, generally being stronger or significant versus non-significant for older mothers versus younger mothers. Do you have thoughts on what might be some other important variables to kind of think about, or to explain why we may not see those associations for the younger mothers?
Sure. The first thing that popped into my mind is knowing that education and language are key components, key factors that enable a mother to respond in a way to a child that is age appropriate, developmentally appropriate. And because obviously young mothers haven't completed their education, and for developmental reasons, particularly perspective taking and understanding the particular needs of a young child. So I would say educational context, and then developmental context of their adolescent, young adult brain, which is still kind of reworking neural connections, and is really gearing up to solidify that social brain. I've done a lot of research thinking about the time span between adolescence and young adulthood, and that is from a lot of neurobehavioral research, neurocognitive research. It is a key time when that social brain is solidifying. And I think the key point I keep on going back to is that perspective taking. What would the child need in this situation to be engaged, to be stimulated? So those were my thoughts. Did you have any that popped out to you, Melissa?
Well, I just thought it was interesting that the actual mean levels of cognitive stimulation were similar in the older and the younger mothers. So suggesting that that it's the associations to children. So I have to say, one thing I wondered about, and this is maybe no surprise for those of you who know that one of the things I researched is grandmother involvement, is I do wonder about other co-parenting figures. And sort of, one of the limitations of the data is that it's just reporting on the co-parenting relationship with the child's father. So really thinking about the role, maybe especially of other extended family members who may be involved in co-parenting, and if maybe you could capture that quality. I know you can't in fragile families. You might have a more similar pattern, or a stronger.
Right. Great insight. Yes.
Looks like we have a question here in the Q&A. So Desiree, I would be happy to, we can read it, or I'd be happy to, well, let me do this. I will allow you to talk, and if you would prefer for us just to read your question, that's okay too.
Sure. I can go ahead and just kind of speak on that a little bit more. I'm a data analyst and work with home visitation programs in Pima County, and some of the qualitative commentary that has come out is that mothers would love to have fathers be more involved in the programs. And I'm just wondering, given your research, are there any practical applications that home visitors can take away and bring that to the families to try to involve that co-parenting aspect a little bit more?
That's a great question, Desiree. And, I just stumbled upon some research that explored a cultural adaptation of a co-parenting program. I'm not sure if it was home visiting, but my hunch is that it was, because they actually, Melissa, to your point, had conversations with multiple family members who are co-parents. So one of the big takeaways of the study is, though the curriculum was adapted to better engage fathers, they also realized there are a lot of other co-parents for young mothers. So it's this real complex network. So I think, to your question, Desiree, is even kind of taking a step back and exploring who are the core caregivers for a child in a young family. I think as well, having some cultural capital with young families, young fathers. I mentioned prior that a lot of families have mixed feelings around formal educational systems, and finding some type of common ground, shared ground, whether it's experiential. I know I've been researching potential adaptations of home visiting programs, and so many young families and young fathers say, if my home visitor had my set of experiences or knew where I came from, that would be a very meaningful, a meaningful way to engage them. And, my common answer is going, kind of going to the source, is asking fathers, having a focus group to see, is it time of day? Is it modality? Is it that fathers don't feel comfortable letting someone in their home? I feel like there are a lot of variable factors, and there's also a lot of work being done. My former doctoral advisor, Holly Schindler, does a lot of work with father involvement in home visiting programs and cultural adaptations for Latino fathers. So I think there's a lot of work out there, and I'm learning about it as well. So I wish I could provide you more information.
No, thank you. That's really helpful, because that's another thing that is coming up is ensuring that the home visitors have some kind of shared experience or cultural background with the families that they're visiting, and that just kind of confirms that. Thank you.
Any other questions? I wonder too that exchange made me think a little bit too about the timing of the study, and wondering if maybe some of that sort of prime window for working on that supportive co-parenting relationship, given all of the kind of barriers that you talked about, may have already started to close for some of the younger adult mothers, and really thinking about
Yes.
the opportunity.
Yeah, that's a great insight. And I know some of the most successful intervention work with co-parenting, building supportive co-parenting relationships in young families has occurred, in that sweet spot of a few months before the baby's due, and then shortly thereafter. So it covers that transition to parenthood. And I will say, for the work that I recently completed looking at it looked at growth trajectories of supportive co-parenting, doing the growth trajectory, and growth trajectories of children's problem behaviors. The starting level of supportive co-parenting was measured at the earliest time point, which was year 1. So 1 year after the child was born. This study was at year 3, and I think you're spot on, Melissa, by that amount of time. And it can probably, if you toggled back to some other findings, would demonstrate that a large proportion of families or young couples have broken up, are no longer engaged. So I think there is that really sensitive time period. And I also think, again, about, the developmental stage that young parents are in, their brains, adolescence and young adult, well, adolescence is the second most, malleable point in terms of brain plasticity, right? It's next to early childhood. It's a time to intervene, and understanding that you have a parent whose brain is geared up for responsive relationship building, positive reinforcement, positive relationships, and also young child. I see that it's really almost a missed opportunity for a lot of programs to take a step back and say, instead of thinking of these families as what they don't have, education, income, etc., there is this real richness of their experience and their just stage in development that is, commonly overlooked, but is a real asset.
It's a really important point. Again, thinking about what are the strengths that they have, that sort of the possibility to really build on that during that critical time period. Any other questions, comments? Anyone else? Okay, well, I could go on and on, but I'm not going to do that. I'm going to go ahead and stop for today. I do just want to thank everyone for attending.